Well, here we are again at a roadside monument on Samoa Beach in Humboldt County that marks the location where a large U.S. Navy warship named the USS Milwaukee ran aground off our coast in January 1917. Now, we covered the full story of the USS Milwaukee naval disaster in a previous episode, which you can find on the Access Humboldt website in their archive section. However, today we are here to learn more about the submarine that triggered a series of events that led to the stranding of the USS Milwaukee right out here. Because the USS Milwaukee became stranded out here while it was trying to tow a US Navy submarine off the beach. And that submarine was the USS H3, and it was a naval submarine that had become stranded a month prior in December of 1916. And to learn more about that riveting story, I headed over to the Humboldt Bay Maritime Museum, where I met with author John Humboldt Gates. John wrote a book titled Before the Dolphins Killed that gives a detailed account of the submarine stranding and the harrowing rescue of the crew based on eyewitness accounts and historical documents. So I invite you to join me as we learn more about the submarine that stranded off our coast over 100 years ago, right here in Humboldt, outdoors. In the early 1900s, submarines were a new type of vessel for the US Navy, and they weren't exactly sure how they were going to use them in warfare. So the reason the H3 was cruising off our coast in December of 1916 is because at the time, the US Navy was considering Humboldt Bay as a future submarine base. Well, the H3 was part of a naval flotilla that consisted of two other submarines, the H1 and the H2, and an escort ship off the coast known as the Cheyenne. Well, at the time, the H3 was cruising out here all alone in heavy fog. The escort ship Cheyenne was miles offshore, and the other two submarines were far to the north. And we're just about at the location where the H3 ran aground. Okay. This is my best estimate of where the H3 submarine ran aground about 300 yards offshore. This is how it all went down. It was a cold, foggy morning on December 14th, 1916. The H3 submarine was on the surface, cruising down the Humboldt coast. The sub's captain was Lieutenant Harry Bogish, peering through this extremely thick fog, trying to see if he could find the entrance to Humboldt Bay, which is about a mile south of our current position. They didn't have radar in those days. So he has a crew member out on the front of the submarine dropping this weighted rope with knots on it called the sounding line to find out how deep the water is. Well, all of a sudden, the sounding line shows 3 fathoms. Okay, this is horrifying news, because 3 fathoms means the bottom of the sub is less than 6 feet from the sandy bottom, and this sub is going up and down on these really big swells. So immediately, Captain Bogish yells down to his crew through the hatch, "Hey, reverse the engines, get us out of here!" Or something to that effect. Well, Lieutenant Bogish was a little too late, because almost right after that, especially large swell lifted the sub up. And then came the terrifying drop as the wave crashed over the submarine and was driving that submarine down into the sand. And I'll let John tell you what happened next.
And then the next wave came and the sub came down hard and it hit bottom. And it was a crushing, the weight of that thing coming down and hitting, it jarred the whole boat, and then another wave came right behind him and it rolled the thing over. Like you got a conning tower up here, and it just thing went flat into the sea. Everybody inside just fell on top of each other. They were landing on top, and they just had breakfast. And one of the kind of funny in the midst of horror, but the cook had all this pancake batter, and the pancake batter landed on top of everybody, so they were covered with pancake batter and they were stacked on top of each other. And then the sub stabilized for a minute, and then it got swung around somehow, and then it flapped the other way, went over a hard roll. Tools and forks and knives and all this stuff flying around in the cabin. And then things got into the electrics, into the electrical panels. And now they got fires. So you've got salt water coming in the open vents and the open hatch. So Bogish, really fast, he sent crew members running along the hull, checked for hull breach, you know, if the structure had been ruptured because they hit so hard. He's got guys trying to get up in and shut the hatches. One guy gets up there, he's going to pull the hatch down, the sub falls over to the side again, he falls off, then falls to the floor. Another sailor goes up and he gets a hold of the hatch. So they're slowly closing these hatches, but all the salt water's already inside the boat. Inside that boat, there's 2,000 gallons of sulfuric acid underneath in the battery chambers. And now the boat's up on its side, and all this acid can start to leak out of those chambers. So that's what creates chlorine, is salt water and sulfuric acid, which chlorine was a weapon in World War I, I mean chlorine gas. And so now they have fires, a subtle amount of chlorine gas, and he realizes that the air is deteriorating really quickly. They got the fires out, and then Bogish makes the next decision, bring everybody into this control room. Okay, here's a room for 6 people. He had 20 people in there. And people are, if you imagine like an elevator, you know, crammed. And he didn't have room for everybody, so he ordered some of the gunner crew to go up into the torpedo room. So you've got 27 people on the boat, 4 or 5 guys up in the torpedo room where they went. You've got 20 people in the control room. And then you had 2 up in this little compartment in between the conning tower.
The conditions inside the H3 were just terrible. These 10 to 20 foot waves would rock the submarine back and forth, and the poor crew down inside would hold on to whatever they could to keep from getting slammed into the metal interior sides or into each other. They tried to stabilize it a little bit by flooding the ballast tanks, but this submarine had a rounded bottom, so it was still like a log just rocking back and forth in the surf. They did manage to put out the fires though, although they were still smoldering away. And that air was incredibly toxic. So in between waves, a crew member would desperately open up the hatch to let in a little bit of fresh air and quickly close it before the next wave washed over the submarine. They did have one lucky break though. Early on, they managed to send out a Morse code distress call. Well, right after they sent that out, a huge wave broke the antenna off the top of the submarine, and then they lost total radio contact with the outside world. But that SOS signal was picked up, and it was relayed out to the U.S. Navy ship Cheyenne, 25 miles off the coast, which was commanded by Lieutenant William Howe. As soon as he got the message, he headed full speed ahead for the stranded submarine. It took him about 2 hours to reach it. And once he got there, I'll let John tell you how the first rescue attempt turned out.
And Commander Howe, who's on the Cheyenne, he launches a lifeboat off the Cheyenne with about a dozen guys in it with a tow line, and they're going to try and get a line on that sub, and he's going to try and pull it out of the breakers. But when they get up to the backside of these breakers, these things are going up and crashing. Well, if they get that lifeboat inside the break, they're probably never going to get it back out. So they shut down that idea. They come back, and the Cheyenne goes full speed in for Humboldt Bay.
So around the time that the Cheyenne was attempting its rescue, the local U.S. Coast Guard, commanded by Lawrence Ellison, hauled their gear from their Humboldt Bay station through the dunes to reach this beach. It took them about 2 hours. In addition to a lifeboat, they also brought a device known as a Lyle gun. It was essentially a cannon that shot a weight with a line attached. And their plan was to shoot this rope out to the submarine where hopefully one of the crew members could tie it off, and then they could use it sort of like a zip line to evacuate the submarine. Well, they tried 2 attempts, and both attempts ultimately failed. Meanwhile, the gathering crowd, probably a lot of them right here on this bluff, were clamoring for Ellison to launch the lifeboat. Well, Ellison was a seasoned lifesaver who had rescued scores of people from ships in distress along the Humboldt coast for more than a decade. And he firmly believed that a lifeboat rescue at that point would be disastrous in itself. So he held back. Well, meanwhile, Lieutenant Howe, the naval captain of the Cheyenne, marched to this beach with 100 of his crew. And Commander Howe is furious to see that the Coast Guard hasn't launched the lifeboat to rescue the crew. Well, I'll let John tell you what happened when Lieutenant Howe, the irate naval captain, encountered Lawrence Ellison, the Coast Guard skipper.
And by the time he gets to where Ellison is, he's livid. And he's just yelling at Ellison. Ellison holding his ground and telling Howe, the commander, the Navy commander, he says, I know these waters, you don't. Let me do my job, and we're gonna get these people off the boat. Howe backs up a little bit, but he's still very mad, you know, at Ellison's response to all this.
At this point, conditions were getting really desperate inside the submarine. They had been trapped in there for over 4 hours, breathing these toxic fumes and just getting slammed back and forth by those huge waves. Some of the crew were semi-conscious or on the verge of going unconscious. Lieutenant Bogish realized he had to get the sub a little closer to shore so they could do a beach rescue. So he emptied the ballast tank so the sub would be a little bit lighter and float in closer to shore. Meanwhile, back here on this beach, the pressure on Ellison from the spectators and the U.S. Navy to launch a lifeboat rescue, it was relentless. The naval commander Howe even threatened to seize the Coast Guard lifeboat, put in his own crew to go attempt a rescue. But Ellison held his ground and he refused to relinquish the lifeboat. At some point, Ellison noticed that the submarine had drifted in a little bit closer to shore on the incoming tide, and he made the decision to launch a lifeboat rescue with 8 of his crew, headed up by the fearless Werner Swains.
So they launch into the surf, and the breakers, I mean, they had to go over the top of these breakers. They're rowing against the breakers. I mean, these guys are hardy, you know, rescuers. And so these guys are rowing like crazy against the surf, and they get the bow right up, and all these people are on the beach. They kind of go silent because this is like a critical moment. And Swains jumps, and he lands on, he gets a finger grip on it, but he's on the boat. And everybody cheers, and then this breaker comes over the top of the sub and just washes him off, and now he's in the water. Swains gets back aboard the rescue boat, and they roll him in again. He gets a hand grip, and just about is up on the deck, and another breaker comes over the top and takes him off. The third time, Swains gets on the deck and just holds on for everything, clambers up, you know, kicks, scrawls. He's got this line with him, and he gets on the boat, and he secures like a really good, you know, knot, and he's got it.
So once they got that line connected from the submarine to the shore, they used it sort of like a zip line to evacuate the crew members one by one, using a device known as a breeches buoy they hooked into the rope, and those on shore would then pull the breeches buoy with the crew member to the shore. Well, that was kind of a challenge because breeches buoys were normally used to evacuate crew members off of ship decks, which were much higher up. The submarine was practically at sea level, so there wasn't much drop. So when they were evacuating these crew members, they would actually just fall off the submarine and go underwater for quite a distance as they were being pulled to shore. And John will tell you about the grueling experience that those crew members had to endure while being rescued.
This has been 10 hours that they've been trapped inside, getting banged around. Some of these guys have been clinging to just pipes. So the rescue is just in time. So now they've got the breeches buoy on the submarine with the line fixed to the beach. So they started taking people out one by one. The problem is they don't have enough height. And when he went off the deck of the sub, the guy just disappeared underwater, and people on the beach were pulling on this rope. And the guy would kind of surface and go back underwater, and now he's underwater being dragged to the beach, and he's coughing up salt water. He's swallowed it. He couldn't hold his breath long enough, and they pull him out of the surf, and all these hands grab him, and There were a lot of people there. Now, they had this enormous bonfire going, and they had food, they had blankets, and the last person was off at sunset. That whole ordeal had been 10 hours. And from that, all the crew was rescued. You had 2 people that were pretty severely injured that had to be taken to the hospital. You had people with exposure, some with minor shock probably. You had different conditions, but everybody was in pretty good shape and good spirits. It was a big ordeal, and at the end of the day, all these people are standing around the fire, they're joking, they're kind of reliving the moment now that they were out of it. But the submarine, as the sun set, the submarine was still out there. And they closed the hatches, and they left it there that night.
Well, John and I laid out the main sequence of events that occurred in that mid-December day in 1916 when a naval submarine ran aground here on Samoa Beach here in Humboldt County. There are so many more fascinating and intricate details about that story that you can read for yourself. So after the crew was successfully rescued off of the H3, tidal action and waves over the following days carried the submarine in closer and closer to shore to the point that it became a local tourist attraction. So the US Navy solicited bids from the private sector to get that submarine back out into the ocean. Well, the lowest bid came in from local Humboldt County based contractor Mercer Fraser. Well, the US Navy didn't take Mercer Fraser's bid seriously, so they decided they were going to bring in one of their mighty warships, the USS Milwaukee, and they were going to tow that submarine back out into the ocean using brute strength. And as I mentioned before, that didn't go exactly as planned, because while the Milwaukee was trying to tow the submarine back out into the ocean, the Milwaukee itself became caught in the surf and became permanently stranded a short ways down the beach from here. And as for the H3, well, after the USS Milwaukee became permanently stranded, the US Navy accepted local contractor Mercer Fraser's bid. So Mercer Fraser came out here and they lifted that submarine up out of the sand, dragged it off the beach, through the sand dunes into Humboldt Bay, a distance of a little under 1 mile. And to do so, they charged the US Navy $18,000. But you know, that is a story for another day right here in Humboldt, outdoors.
Dug out the sand around the sub, and they built a scaffolding, big timbers. They used timber jacks. They jacked the sub up, and they lashed down the side of the submarine 2 big trees. And then they built a wooden railroad, and they hooked the cables on with a steam donkeys, like they moved the redwood logs in the early 1900s. And they started pulling this submarine off the beach.
This would be the approximate location where it would have been dragged up off the beach through the sand dunes by Mercer Fraser. So we're going to spend some time poking around and see if we can find any artifacts from that. So let's dig in and see. Oh man, I think this is a rusty old metal chain, which is something definitely Mercer Fraser would have used during the salvage efforts. Oh, there's like an old piece of wood here sticking out. This is really exciting.